Yeah, no, let she'll tell you. This is he's sharing this. What is this? Specific inclusion.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
So Manisha will introduce you. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, I'm Manisha. Hi, I'm Manisha from first year urban design, master student, and I would like to take this opportunity to introduce you. Sourav Kumar Biswas is a co-founder and principal of Samanea Consultancy, a strategic planning and design firm based in Chennai, Bengaluru, India, and Lyon, France. He has professional and academic experience in territorial economic development, urban and regional planning, climate adaptation, and resilient infrastructure. He has worked in more than 20 countries across Asia, Latin America, Middle East with public, private, and multilateral clients while working for GeoAdaptive, Sasaki, AECOM, SLA, Corgan, and Serie Architects. Saurav has a master in landscape architecture from Harvard University and a Bachelor of Architecture from University of Texas at Austin. Welcome, sir.
Yeah. So thank you all. Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be virtually back at KRVIA. So today I'll present some of the early work that we are doing as a Sponge Collaborative, where we are really introducing a nature-based approach and promoting the Sponge City idea in India from the basin to the site scale. And so today I'll briefly go over what have been our efforts in trying to mainstream the Sponge City approach in India, what we have been learning, and how we have been advancing that at the basin scale through strategic basin planning and by trying to influence development plans, and then quantifying and qualitatively evaluating the feasibility of Sponge cities within Chennai through pilot projects, and what learnings we can get from it to really create systemic change. So we started as a multidisciplinary strategic planning and design firm. We specialize in landscape architecture, and urban design, bringing quite a bit of spatial analytics and centering ecology in the way that which we plan our cities and our communities, and how we think about socio-ecological systems through a systems lens. So we're always integrating mobility, sustainability within blue-green infrastructure, integrating culture. That's something that you will see. Our primary motivation is that we want to be professionals that help communities and cities adapt to climate change. Early on in my career, the 2005 floods in Mumbai basically triggered my interest in landscape architecture. The floods in 2015 in Chennai, followed by the drought in 2019, inspired our first publication, the Sponge Handbook Chennai, which is available online for you to download. That was where we first made the case that the Sponge City approach is really the most cost-effective and has a lot of core benefits in helping cities adapt to climate change and also meet their service needs. And I'm sure heat waves are going to become a real issue in cities in the coming years. We also find the nature of urbanization actually placing our cities at even greater risk. So our risk threat is not just from climate change, but the way in which we are maladapting to climate change and the way that we are basically disrupting the natural-based solutions that could have protected us from issues that we're actively destroying through bad planning, and that we don't have any structures for how our cities are expanding into the landscapes that could have been building our resilience. So we are here to basically address climate change through the promotion and implementation of nature-based solutions, which have to happen at multiple scales. We have to protect the regional systems that work. We have to restore the ecological systems like water bodies and rivers that are either degraded or polluted, wetlands included. We have to enhance our natural ecosystems to actually be resilient to climate change that will place even greater pressures in more constrained environments. So we have to think about hybrid infrastructures. And we definitely have to construct blue-green infrastructure within urban areas that have completely removed the historic natural functions that used to be there. So how do we kind of bring them back through blue-green infrastructure? And we are trying to do this in an interdisciplinary manner, where we are trying to establish a very strong studio culture and moving forward in that vision by bringing together architects, landscape architects, urban designers, and planners. We are currently about 15, 17 people in the Chennai and the Bangalore office, while I am working and advising from Lyon, France. We have two partners, Manushi and Praveen. All three of us had met at Sasaki in Boston after them having done their masters in Pratt and Berkeley. And so we met, we did the Chennai competition together that we won with GIZ. We did another competition in Kochi that we also won. You can access both of those entries online if you look for them. And based on those early successes, we decided that we need to start a firm to really push the agenda in India. And so we have been dedicatedly doing this through a lot of lobbying, through a lot of discussions at various levels, trying to find opportunities through multilaterals and others. And in some ways, I wouldn't take sole responsibility, but Chennai has kind of moved to the fact that they want to set up multiple sponge parks. They have seen the value of that given the risks that they are facing. And we are currently helping the city implement at least one sponge park out of the dozens that are currently under consideration. So as I mentioned, we kind of kicked off this whole thing in 2018, even though our firm is about 2 years old. In 2018, we basically wrote this publication with GIZ that summarized the application of blue-green infrastructure, what it means, how they can be integrated within the Indian context. And we actually even showed them how to integrate that within the urban fabric in a site in Chennai, taking the basin approach, recognizing that every site has to understand the hydrological linkages that are part of a basin. So we're not just in a river, we're not just in a canal, we are part of a larger basin that drains into the river. And there's also the invisible aquifer systems that are much harder to trace, but they're all part of this one system. And that we can build resilience collectively, incrementally over time by being strategic about how we do short-term, medium-term, and long-term projects to eventually do things like canal rejuvenation and then benefit from the real estate benefits that come off of it, and how all those systems, once they're built, actually makes a new development more resilient than what was previously in place. And that should be our goal in the kind of developments that we do. Following that, we had successes in Kochi, where we did a detailed project report for the rejuvenation of a canal precinct, where we had a vision for the precinct level, and we had vision for how to rejuvenate the canal and connect it to mobility networks that are then upgraded for bike lanes, but also integrating blue-green infrastructure. So how all these systems come together along the streets and also within the open spaces. So the idea is always, how do you find spaces within the city that are designed to flood? So the things that flood are not the streets, are not the homes, but these open spaces and these blue-green infrastructures within the street. And so this was the kind of the larger vision that we had for the neighborhood and how that ties together around the canal. And we had different interventions based on aquifer recharge, based on vendor enhancement, based on recycling and community-based infrastructure, and even shoreline enhancement and wetland rejuvenation. And then a similar project in that vein was in Coimbatore, where with TU Berlin, we did a DPR for a sponge park, which basically integrates social amenities with blue and green infrastructure. So here you can see how we had a social loop with a lot of programs around, very well shaded to counter from the heat island effect. And then basically we are grading the entire park and creating provisions for water to flow during moderate storms, but also for water to go into the aquifer during extreme storms. So we are creating these levels of how water collects in different places. So there's a wet function and a dry function, where basically it's a park throughout the year, but during any flood events, it also serves as infrastructure. We take this concept even further in a peri-urban park that we are doing in Chennai, which is a 17-acre climate park that we are calling it. It's basically a showcase of all the regional landscapes of the Chennai region and how each of them can play a role in climate adaptation, whether it's through the greening of forests or the renaturification, you could say, of, instead of lawns, celebrating meadows, and how in the region, in the farmlands, you build these retention ponds. And then we also celebrate these kind of hills and hillocks that are found in the region, through some architectural moves. And we also celebrate the coastal landscape, even though the site is somewhere in the peripheries, through the integration of water-based play and water features that teach kids about how important all of these ecosystems are. So we basically focused on these 4 ecosystems that are found in the Chennai region and found ways to reflect that within the design and the planting and the massing of the parks. And so you will find these 4 different zones within the park, which have very distinct signages that are color-coded. You have this continuous ribbon that's connecting all the different zones, but the landscaping of every zone, the architecture, the color schemes of each zone, and even the programs kind of tie back to this idea of what are the regional landscapes with some signages on how it can help. And it's also linked to an archaeological interpretation center because this is kind of located right off of an ASI site. And so we're basically bringing in the geological and the archaeological histories of the region with a kind of environmental lens, talking about climate risks. So that's just an overview of how we are bringing that approach through multiple projects. But the core of my lecture is about how we are taking a basin level view, how all these systems come together in our thought process. And based on that, I'll follow this up also with a detailed sponge implementation project and how we went from feasibility to going towards implementation. So this is a project that we did, one through funding from a foundation where we did a river scale vision. And now we are also working with the CMDA on informing their 3rd master plan on the theme of climate resilience, where this view is coming into play. So one of the things with Chennai, as you will also find out about Mumbai, or you know about Mumbai, is the number of basins that are within the metropolitan area. For Chennai, which is a coastal area with a lot of peripheral landscapes, basically this metropolis straddles about 4 basins and sub-basins today, but the metropolitan area is expected to expand into 3 more basins in time. And the drinking water reservoir system is also very much linked to the health of the basins. And we also have many estuaries and lakes along the shoreline. So it's a very diverse shoreline with many different basins, water bodies that are all connected with each other, but all these connections are basically getting severed over time. So we used to have traditional landscapes in the region that connected all these different water bodies. Sometimes you would find temple tanks that are designed to hold water during the monsoons and allow it to seep into the ground. But all these linkages that used to happen with the water bodies do get disrupted by the way in which urbanization happens, but also in the way in which mining and other encroachments pollute those ecosystems. And so we are basically trying to counter these impacts by introducing the water sensitive design approach, where instead of thinking about how we very quickly rush water away, so not treating the city as a rain jacket, because what it eventually does is it basically creates flooding either in the canals or in the rivers or in the reservoirs. And basically it's not that conducive to the fact when a high tide comes in and makes that conduit less effective to move away. So instead of relying on a single conduit, you're basically taking the sponge city approach, where we are finding different ways within the city through open spaces, through green roofs, through green streets, for water to be delayed. So a storm event doesn't immediately become runoff and lands up in the stormwater drains. There is a delay, and that delay builds that resilience, but there's also absorption, there's also storage. And so all these different functions basically work together to reduce the risk of flooding while creating a lot of co-benefits, because parks, they're great for many other things. Trees help not just with flooding, but also with urban heat. So that's the kind of approach that we are promoting. The other thing that we are recognizing, and I'm not going to go into detail on this slide, but the main idea is that to build urban resilience requires us to navigate a lot of institutional complexity. And as planners, we are able to inform, or urban designers, we are able to inform land use strategies, we are able to involve urban development strategies, but all of that has to work together and be compatible with this whole infrastructure on disaster risk reduction and management, which happens at the local, state, and national levels. And depending on the metropolitan area, very different ways in which water resource is managed. It's different in Chennai, it's different in Delhi, it's different in Mumbai. But the reality is a lot of water body management, whether it's rivers and lakes, are very fragmented across different silos. And so within that, we are trying to use the tools of planning to embed resilience, whether it's disaster risk resilience or urban water resilience. And we have to be cognizant of how we navigate that. So in Chennai, we have the opportunity now to basically inform the priorities of the next master plan. This is something that the Metropolitan Authority has had the vision to do, which is actually set up a process to highlight what should be the principles that guides the land use of the third master plan. That is not just a bureaucratic exercise in checking boxes and assigning arbitrarily what the land uses should be, that there's actually a vision for it. And from our perspective, we think that no master plan in most Indian cities has actually recognized the ecological systems at the metropolitan scale and what it means to manage urban growth by absorbing the principles of nature-based solutions. So the principles of protect, restore, enhance, construct that I showed earlier, we are basically trying to spatialize as a framework at the metropolitan scale, using a lot of different data sets. I myself am a spatial analyst as well by training. So we are basically identifying which are the places that are important for recharge, which are the places that have a lot of wetland ecosystems, and in a way trying to promote a kind of five-fingered corridor approach rather than a continuous urban sprawl. And then we find ways to basically restore all the polluted water bodies or the water bodies that are currently getting encroached upon in the peripheries that have not been completely lost as it is in the urban core. And definitely we have to enhance our rivers and our shorelines to deal with additional flood risks that are happening every year, erosion risks, saline intrusion risks that are happening because of sea level rise and cyclones as well. So how do we enhance these ecosystems? And then finally, we are identifying places where there's a lot of flood-prone urban areas where we can construct blue-green infrastructure. And in places that are conducive to aquifer recharge, it's not conducive everywhere. It depends on the soil, where we basically construct aquifer recharge infrastructure. So we are laying out a metropolitan scale strategy within which we are exploring a basin level vision, where we want to emphasize that a river is not just a river. A river is an interconnected landscape where all these streams, when rainfall over the territory drains into the rivers, it's also connected to the groundwater, it's connected to all these things. And so it really matters how the land use evolves, not just in and around the river, but within the whole basin, because it has a lot of impacts on water quality, on sediments, and basically on flood risk. And so how do we basically think about the growth of the city along these two major corridors while also recognizing the health of the basin that's linked to a very important river? And so we take on a very geospatial analytical approach, but we also take on a very qualitative on-ground observation approach. And combining this, we come up with character zones for the entire basin, recognizing each zone as a socio-ecological label. So if this is an estuary, what is the land use linked to that estuary? So that's an estuary residential zone. This has a lot of marshes and forested areas, but also that's where IIT Madras and a lot of institutions are. So that's what we're calling it. Here we have an airport very similar to what is done with the Methi River. The runway runs right through the river, increasing the flood risk, and this airport basically gets shut down almost every other monsoon. And then we have the riparian peri-urban zone, and then we have these industrial zones where they've built industries just upstream of a drinking water reservoir, where definitely it's important to think about those relationships, and also these headwaters, which are currently rural, but they're definitely going to urbanize in the coming decades and years. And we use these zones to engage many stakeholders to get feedback on what should be the key strategies. And then we come up with a framework for different strategies across 5 systems: an ecological system, a risk and resilience system, culture and livelihoods, open space and access, and what all these factors should mean in terms of urban development and housing. So it's basically an integrated development strategy that's ecologically informed and really cognizant of both the housing demands of the city, the fact that it needs to develop, it needs to grow, it needs to densify, but also it needs to be aware of where not to build and how to integrate open spaces with recreational amenities to create more of a buy-in from communities for the continued preservation of open spaces, trails, and streams. And also keeping in mind that there's still many livelihoods linked to coasts and rivers, and that there are new forms of livelihoods coming up around the river that are more industrial in nature, and how we can basically recognize the historic culture that the region has. So when we talk about a basin vision and we want to replicate this approach at the metropolitan scale, we are talking about an urban development framework that is based on a livelihoods framework, a risk and resilience framework, an open space framework, and an urban ecology framework that basically founds the foundation. So we believe the role of land use planning is primarily a lot about where not to develop and where to encourage growth, and not so much to micromanage exactly what land use needs to go where, because that's something that our institutions are not that capable of enforcing. But we should definitely build the capacity to enforce where not to grow and where to grow intensely, and how each of those developments could potentially be water sensitive and climate resilient. So we base all our frameworks on a kind of ecological mapping where we recognize the different zones around the basin and what that means for the riverfront as well. And that basically informs goals. So each of these analysis frameworks has a goal of how we enhance the ecological value. That means recognizing not just the river as a corridor, which is an ecological corridor, but also how those corridor linkages can extend into the city, and how we can be cognizant of the different ecosystems that the river runs through, from estuary to the upland grasslands with wetlands and forests in between. And then how we basically start increasing or improving the water quality through restoration efforts and enhancing it in other places. By mapping the flood risks with critical infrastructures like ring roads and bus terminuses and hospitals, places that can increase the pollution, the airport is a critical infrastructure. We come up with a goal for how we deal with multi-hazard risks. What are the strategies, where those strategies can land, how we create room for the river, that maybe there's a potential scenario where 20 years down the line, that airport gets decommissioned. Chennai is already planning an airport in a different place. And then we start creating room for the river and maybe even have a water sensitive development around there. And we also talked then about disaster preparedness, which is not so much about structural solutions, but non-structural solutions for how communities and early warning systems can help. We start mapping what are the cultural aspects, what is a scarred landscape, what is a livelihood zone, where are the fishing hamlets, where is some industrial parks opening up, and what could become a kind of rural landscape reserve for the city, and how we kind of celebrate that through archaeological site circuits, heritage trails, and linking those up with the livelihood zones that are coming up, and making sure that those livelihood zones are compatible with the health of the river. So we do have a tannery hub. We just have to figure out how to limit pollution from that tannery hub into these things. So these are just a summary of the different strategies. We have a strategy on the open space where we basically have mapped out what are the adjacent open spaces, some of which are public, some of which are semi-private, semi-public. But where do we completely not have access to the riverfront, and how we can open up that access through a set of interconnected trails, rejuvenate some of the quarries that have been scarred because of mining, open up the campus green spaces that are currently not really open, and then really rethink what happens to the airport in the near future. And this idea of creating 15-minute neighborhoods where nobody's far enough from a park. So even if they're not near the river, they're part of a trail system that links them to the river. And then once you recognize how the city is going to grow, where this future ring road is going to keep building up, where the automobile hubs are, you have to be cognizant about that and really keeping with that protect strategy in mind. Find ways to densify in places where it is safe to densify from a risk perspective and from an ecological perspective. So we're not experiencing sprawl. So we're recognizing where transit-oriented development happens. We're recognizing maybe there's an alternate way for urban villages and rural upland areas to develop if they're not within the corridor, and both of them can coexist as a diversity of built typologies in the metropolitan area that really preserves this rich network of water bodies, which is important for the flood risk of the entire metropolis. And what we did after those high-level frameworks is we actually, the 6 zones that we talked about, we actually landed all those goals within those zones in the form of very specific projects. So I'll quickly just run through what the ecological framework looks like in the estuarine zone, what the risk and resilience framework looks like when it lands within the estuarine zone, where are places that we can create room for flooding, how we can restore the estuarine area, create access along this kind of broken bridge that we can repair, and then connect that with a cultural loop that connects with the temples and the churches and other open spaces and institutions near the river. And what that cultural trail means in the form of other recreational loops and the pedestrianization of certain areas and the introduction of bike trails and other trails that have currently not been imagined as part of the city's open space network, and how all those different frameworks lands in the form of the creation of an urban corridor that's part of, at least in this part of the city, a heritage district conservation, and how, given that there's a bus terminus here, we can think about somewhat of a water sensitive dense development here. But we definitely don't allow development in and around the estuaries in places that are already very well forested. But this also belongs to the Theosophical Society, so this might not open up to development as much. And that together basically gives you a framework and a strategy for each of these zones. We think a river cannot be seen as just one entity. We have to really be respectful and sensitive to the different zones. So we have, all those themes coming together to create a vision for this zone. We have a vision for the institutional zone where we have Anna University and IIT Madras and many other institutions, how that can front a kind of institutional connection to the river. And this is basically, we are reimagining the future of the airport land, where the airport goes away, the runway becomes an armature for a mixed-use transit-oriented development, but a lot of the site is basically become room for the river, where now the Adya River finally has that space to flood instead of flooding the runways. And then much further on in the peripheries, we recognize and anticipatorily protect the streams, not just as ecological risk, resilience enhancing networks, but also that they could turn into open space trails. So again, we are creating a double purpose for an ecological amenity, an ecological system, by turning it into an amenity. So there's more buy-in. And then once the city has kind of planned where not to develop, then you start structuring development around transit nodes, around transit-oriented developments, and making sure everyone has access to the services that they need. And then finally, in the very uplands, where we have a series of urban villages, we are talking about an alternate future of how we really treat these landscapes and these settlements, how they can still participate in the urban economy, but they don't need to be the city. And maybe it can benefit from cultural loops, tourism loops, agro-tourism, many different aspects, where we are keeping a kind of wedge landscape preserved within the metropolis area. And this is something that you might see in many Dutch cities. You see it in Chengdu in China. It's what Copenhagen was promoting through the five-finger approach, where you have these green wedges as part of like a lung for the city. And these urban villages can still participate in this urban environment, but in a different paradigm of development. And then finally, in zone 6, which is, like I mentioned, just upstream of a drinking water reservoir, you have industrial townships. So how can we make it an eco-industrial zone through the creation of buffers? And how, because of the ring road, there will inevitably be future development here. But it might as well be that the future development is transit-oriented, and that we are creating the buffers that are needed to prevent the runoff from polluting the reservoir, and that we open up the reservoir also for community access. And that's the kind of big idea for that zone. So all of that gives you an idea of how we are tackling this at the basin scale. And very quickly, I'll show you what we are achieving at the site scale with the sponge park. This might be one of the country's first sponge parks that was a result of a very detailed feasibility study that we did. And this might be of interest to you if you're interested in this topic, but basically the design of stormwater drains is dictated by a CPHEO manual that requires cities to only be resilient to a 1 in a 5-year flood event. And so what we set out to try to prove is, can we manage a 5-year return period storm through the construction of blue-green infrastructure? And will that network, is it feasible spatially to be constructed in an urban neighborhood? And if we do it, is it more cost effective than gray infrastructure? And basically, if so, then this should become the way in which blue-green infrastructure is integrated into the country. Because what the manual says is, if it's too expensive to manage this level of flooding, then try to supplement it with best management practices, which includes a lot of the strategies we're proposing. Yeah, so one of the things that we wanted to point out to everyone is we are working in another basin of Chennai, which is in the north, is the Kosastaliyar Basin. And we basically picked 2 flood-prone neighborhoods to see where our strategies would be feasible. It turned out, after doing a lot of the studies, that it's more feasible on this side. So that's what I'll zoom into. But the one thing I want to bring to your notice, if you're interested, is we were initially supposed to be planning for 2-year return period storms, which is before the new manuals. And we think even this designing for a 5-year return period storm is not adequate. Basically, what it means is not that in a 5-year stretch, you're only going to get that storm once. It means that in any given year, there's a 20% chance of a storm event exceeding the level of that return period storm. So return period storm basically determines how much rainfall is going to occur, and people design stormwater drains around the peak runoff volume that that event creates. But I think people have the misassumption that a 1 in a 5-year storm means in my entire tenure it's only going to happen once, when in reality what it means is in 5 years there's a 67% chance it's definitely going to happen, or storms that exceed it. And in any given year there's a 20% chance. So people are playing with the risk of only being able to manage these storms even when a stormwater network is constructed. So in places that don't have stormwater networks, the risk is just unmanaged. And what we actually set out to prove is that through the implementation of our network, we are even able to manage a 25-year return period storm without making any upgrades to the gray infrastructure that was designed to only handle this storm. So I think that's a big finding that we are going to promote in public as soon as this project is done. But we take a very scientific approach to this. We did a very detailed land cover mapping and street surveys in GIS CAD with field visits and reconnaissance. We then evaluated all the streets and the open spaces for their potential spatially to integrate blue-green infrastructure. And then we worked with IIT Madras and other engineers to quantify what would be the impact of this network on flood mitigation and aquifer recharge. And the reason we do this, I don't know how many of you are wanting to move into the infrastructure sector after your degree, but the reason we do this is because runoff is linked to basically what is the permeability of the area, what is the intensity of the rainfall, and what is the area itself. And so basically in India, infrastructure is designed around, okay, if this is the rainfall event, then we have to design for the largest amount of volume, and that should be the sizing of the stormwater conduits. But nobody really thinks about how can we basically reduce the runoff coefficient by basically increasing the permeability of the catchment area. So if you basically manage to reduce the permeability, imperviousness of roads by planting more trees, you're basically creating almost like a 5 to 9-fold reduction in what volume your stormwater networks need to manage. And so that's why we did a very detailed mapping of the land cover, so we can think about what are the ways in which we modify that land cover. And we found that, you know, this site is this much % impervious, it has this much % roads, this much of the vegetation and canopy. This type of data doesn't quite exist in the way that we need it to exist, so we do the painstaking process of really mapping everything from canopies to the land cover types. We do a digital mapping, we reference the Google Street Maps, we reference high resolution imagery, we validate a lot of that with site visits, and then we also go on and survey different sites and streets, recognizing where there's the stormwater drain, where there's the sewage drain, how are the sidewalks used. And then we are finding places for these type of interventions to come in. Where can we put in trees and rain gardens? Where can we put in bioswales? Where can we, in the open spaces, amend the soil? Because urban soil is traditionally very compacted. But if we just open up the soil and bring in more healthy soil, we are creating essentially storage capacity within the soil and creating more delay. And then using that soil to basically green our open spaces, a lot of which are usually very bare in the urban context. So this is an example of some of the interventions that we are proposing, which is a rain garden. And this is a kind of subterranean view where the idea, like I mentioned, was bringing runoff into a vegetated space so water is delayed. We have some storage capacity in the root balls and the soil, so we are creating storage. And only when that storage starts filling up, then the overflow ends up in the stormwater drains. And then the trees and other things are also playing an important role in intercepting rainfall and everything else. And then we basically, like we said, did a survey of all the streets. We classified them as primary, secondary, and tertiary. I'm only going to show you an example of a primary street, which basically has a 6-meter carriageway, but a very unorganized kind of shoulder with a very minimal sidewalks. And so what we then propose is like keeping in mind where are the commercial entrances, the building entrances, the parking requirements, and where vendors organize. We basically organize the shoulder for vendors, and then we find places to basically increase either tree cover or insert the rain gardens that I showed you in the diagram before. And so this is what the street looks like today. We know where the stormwater drains are, we know where the sewage drains are, we know what are the open spaces. And so this is what the street looks like today, and this is what the street looks like in plan, where we are introducing a lot more canopy cover. We are introducing rain gardens where it's possible for us to do it, and then that framework is kind of applied across the site. So then we can quantify how many rain gardens are we proposing, how many trees, how many bioswales, where are we amending the soils in the open spaces, both big and small. And we have quantified what is their area, what is their volume. And that's when we start evaluating whether the construction of all these networks and how the runoff from the streets landing up in the rain gardens, runoff from the roofs that land up in storage tanks, and all of these can also land up in these open spaces where water is collected for temporary storage, and then water eventually makes its way into the aquifer, which is very important. And so we basically started, after the framework was done, to quantify what it does. So we worked with engineers and surveyors to conduct soil tests. We looked at invert levels for where water is supposed to go and go into the water bodies. We did use hydrology softwares to understand stream flows and how each catchment is managing water and how much water it's getting, how much runoff it's generating, and what that means from a hydrographic perspective. So instead of getting this much volume in a storm event, we have reduced the effective volume of runoff that's generated because of our interventions. And then through our interventions, we are able to manage that runoff without increasing the size of the pipes. And we have basically quantified what that means. And the thing that the software is quantifying is, like I mentioned, how much rainwater the canopy intercepts before it becomes runoff, and how much does the soil and the sub-base layer keep storing before it gets saturated. And so that's when the process of either infiltration and overflow begins. So we did that for rain gardens, we did that for our infiltration basins that we proposed, and we did that for the sunken courts. And we were able to basically demonstrate that once you implement this, these areas that would have flooded in a 25-year return period will not be flooding anymore because of our interventions, and that we have, increased this much of the aquifer recharge, and we have reduced this much of the runoff volume, and we can do that all for the cost of, we have costed the intervention for less than 8 crores. And that basically means if you had to upgrade your gray infrastructure to manage the same level of storms, you would have to have invested 17.3 crores. And we think it's important to think in that term, because a 25-year storm today, because of climate change, might be a lot more frequent in the coming decades. And the other thing that people don't keep in mind is that when they do the calculations for a certain runoff, they're assuming the land cover always stays the same, but we are working in a peri-urban environment where a lot of undeveloped parcels are yet to be urbanized. So it's always better to prepare for more extreme storms than what you're currently required to do. And we ran many different kinds of cost-benefit analysis of what would happen if you actually involved us early on in your design process, and we were to design for a 5-year storm. It would have cost you this much instead of that much. And we are saving you this much money to manage a 25-year storm. And then we also started calculating the co-benefits in terms of air pollution reduction, in terms of ozone removal, in terms of noise reduction, all of those, carbon sequestration. We actually see that over a 10-year period, you're making a returns of 15.2 crores, whatever. It's like a co-benefit. It's not monetary value, but it's really value that that citizens are getting from an investment that was only about 8 crores. We also try to build capacities within the municipalities where maintenance is a very critical issue, and we want to emphasize that. So we have a maintenance manual as part of our project to tell them how to maintain these sponge parks, because vegetation and how long they survive is very important to the functioning of it. And also the maintenance of the outlets and the inlets. So we are budgeting all of that into our proposal as well. The maintenance budget, hiring a horticulturist. And so within this big site that I showed you, we basically zoomed in on this place as where we will do our pilot site. So the feasibility study was to identify how we solve the flooding issue, but also identify what's a pilot project that can most effectively mitigate some type of flooding. So we think within this catchment, sub-catchment, working in this kind of football playground would be an ideal site for the pilot site, where basically, principally what we are doing is turning a very bare, compacted soil that doesn't do much to slow down runoff into something that's, like I said, amended with the soil, greened, forested, and we are integrating the blue-green infrastructure with certain social amenities. And hydrologically, the way it works is all the runoff from the streets goes into a filtering forebay, and then comes into the open space, and then moves into an infiltration basin where there's a recharge well. And sometimes you also put in sunken court. So basically we are creating terraces for water to flow in before it goes into the aquifer and before the overflow of this moves into the stormwater basin. So water comes in here, sediment collects, it starts moving into the open space that's bundled somewhat, and then the overflow of that moves into the infiltration basin. Some of it starts going into the aquifer, and as all of that fills up, the overflow moves into the stormwater drain. So it's caused quite a bit of delay. It's caused quite a bit of storage in the soils and in these depressions, and it's also creating a lot of recharge. And this is what the infiltration basin looks like at the end, where you have these inflows through vegetation slowly moving into the deep aquifer. It can become a landscape amenity, and the overflow goes into the stormwater drains. So this is just what the site currently looks like. There's a football field, but the rest of it is quite underutilized. And so again, here we bring the idea of how do we integrate social amenities with blue-green infrastructure. And here the community wanted a lot of amenities. So we really had to be very strategic about how we integrate our blue-green infrastructures with social amenities. And so these are the social amenities we proposed, and these are the blue-green kind of infrastructures that are coming together in our design. And so like most things, we have a framework approach to it. The open space is now an infrastructure that reduces flooding and raise aquifers. We are working with the natural slope to basically create a retention at that end and the recharge at the corner. And so we are both, like I said, delaying, storing, and infiltrating runoff. And then we use the space around the football field that we are proposing that was currently underutilized to create different lush planting zones. And around that, we are creating open spaces and amenities, not just for youth, basically male youth that traditionally dominate big football fields. And we are creating other open spaces and small open spaces for seniors, for women, for children, and how all of that basically improves the mental and the physical and the social well-being of the people in the neighborhood, and how all of our planting that happens surrounding the park creates the right microclimate, reduces pollution, improves the air quality within which people can go for jogs and do yoga and play football. We took a lot of community feedback into promoting this approach, explaining them what a sponge park is. So they're quite excited about being one of the first neighborhoods to get sponge parks in the country. But also we really needed their feedback on what they think of the social amenities. And we got feedback saying that they're happy to see a park which currently in a community that has no breathing space for old people and women. So by creating these very diverse open spaces, we are creating opportunities for that. And the interesting thing is we are getting the funding to do this because we made the quantitative case that this will reduce flooding. And so we're basically tapping into stormwater management and flood disaster risk management funding to create an open space for the communities. And that was basically our goal of why we decided to tackle the public sector and why we thought that flooding and urban resilience is an effective, I wouldn't call it Trojan horse because it has negative connotations, but it somewhat is. We are couching the whole project from a flood mitigation lens to be able to create social infrastructure that traditionally doesn't get the funding that it needs. And so in the community where we did all our presentations in Tamil, we brought up those 4 systems and how those 4 systems align as programs and how the park performs as a sponge park, and that instead of having water log and make the football field unusable, creating the risk of mosquitoes, by really grading the whole landscape and finding places for water to end up in and leave, we're protecting their play area and also creating more healthy ways for water to move. So sectionally, this is an exaggeration. We are working with the slope in the long end to create storage capacity here temporarily as they slowly infiltrate and as they also basically overflow into the infiltration basin that creates deep infiltration. So during dry periods, during storms, always thinking about how this multifunctionality can be leveraged. And then we ran the community through what the different amenities mean in different parts of the park. There's amenities for old people, there's amenities for young people, there's amenities for exercising, there's amenities for cultural programs. There's also how the biosphere becomes a very nice and peaceful place to walk through that's different from the jogging trail. And this is how the infiltration basin performs a role, but it can also be a very nice playground and relaxing place and a place to walk around and sit. And because you recognize how safety and public spaces can be a concern, we definitely make the budget and have the lighting consultants to make sure this is well lit at night and used for a much longer period of the day than the park currently is. So we are getting both social buy-in by improving the amenities, and we have gotten basically bureaucratic and multilateral buy-in because we have proven that this is a flood mitigation infrastructure, and everyone's interested in promoting how many co-benefits it brings, especially when you get the community on board, when you get all the local engineers on board, the ward councillor on board, the joint commissioner on board. So this has been a very political process that we have been navigating very carefully to basically come to a point where we can, show a vision like this to the community, and they know that we will at some point definitely secure the funding for it and begin implementation. So we are taking this concept, and these are the different views from the different parts of the park. We are currently basically developing the DPR, and when it is done, we will be able to, like I said, publicize it properly. But I think the main takeaway as I end my lecture is we have to think about, especially the scale of challenges that we are working on, we have to think about multiple actions at multiple scales all at the same time. And we basically always couch our pilot projects within a sub-site master plan. We actually drafted the scope for the project by ourselves because initially the intent of people were just give us a sponge park, just give us a sponge park. And we said, hold on, we have to really understand how a sponge park fits in a larger neighborhood. And we have to have a neighborhood framework because just a single park can't solve flooding. But at the same time, if wrong decisions are made at the metropolitan and the regional scales, like you lose all your wetlands to urbanization or you lose big forests, it doesn't matter that you construct a lot of sponge parks, you lost your natural regional sponge. So that's why we also work at the basin scale. But we think by doing these visions, by doing these master plans, and definitely through implementing pilot projects, this is the most important at moving the political needle. We can actually change things at an institutional level where guidelines are now requiring the implementation of this, where even at the central level, the CPHEO manual that dictates how stormwater drainage is done also picks up on how we integrate blue-green infrastructure. And that basically creates the standards that basically becomes protocol. So you don't need sophisticated consultants like us in some ways to integrate this approach. It just becomes institutionalized and mainstream. But that requires many reforms, and we can get into what kind of reforms it requires if you want to go in a political path. But I'm also happy to kind of discuss with you questions that you have about the design and planning aspects of it. So this is where I will, end my presentation. I think I went over. No, we have half an hour, so that's good. Yeah, thanks. Okay.
Thanks, Saurav. Fantastic presentation. It gives us a lot of insight in terms of the work you do and the rigor in which you kind of looked at the pilot project to kind of show that it actually works. Before asking the students to pose some questions to you, if they have any, I would just like to ask you that how much of this larger proposition has been incorporated into the development plan of Chennai?
Yeah. So the larger vision is a slow-moving wheel, and the good thing that the CMDA is doing, and it might be because the World Bank is involved in it, they're taking a very strategic approach to the development of the third master plan. So they had one consultancy before this one that was about how we institutionally prepare for the third master plan. And the ongoing consultancy that is happening is called the visioning exercise, where they are coming up with what should be the vision of the next master plan. And one of the themes of that master plan is climate resilience and sponge city. Like literally, that's a theme that they want to integrate into the master plan. And we are basically associated not with the larger effort, but with the specific theme. So once that becomes part of the vision, there will at some point be a tendering for the master plan itself, and we hope to be competitive for that at that point and have a hand in that process. But I would say it's a slow-moving wheel. They're planning to basically release the master plan in 2026. So basically between now and the next 3 years, we are on ground in Chennai making sure all the things that we showed you are embedded within the master plan. And we just have to see and try our luck at how much of an influence we have in that process. But we are there, we are on the ground, so we'll be very proactive at it. Yeah.
The second question I have is obviously to kind of make sure that this intention of the sponge city really works. Very often, I mean, I've read some of it. It talks about buildings which kind of look at holding having rainwater harvesting kind of propositions. Yeah. Now, one of the things in the city of Mumbai is that one of the aspects for any occupation certificate is to have rainwater harvesting, and very often that's provided by all clients. And once you've got the certificate to occupy the building, no one really maintains it. So there are two aspects here. One is are you kind of making these propositions also to be incorporated within the regulation? That's the first thing. And the second thing, are there any guidelines in terms of the footprint of the building on the site to kind of encourage this percolation of water into the ground?
Yeah, I think it's the same case with Chennai. They have all the rules and they have all the guidelines in place, and every building is required to have rainwater harvesting. And I think it's mainly an implementation challenge now rather than a design challenge because people have figured out how to do rainwater harvesting. And in this current project, the reason we didn't focus on rainwater harvesting is because we were focused on what is it that the corporation can invest in and build. So rainwater harvesting by buildings is basically a private effort, but basically the state has delegated it to every landowner and building just has to do it. It's part of the regulation, so they don't have to finance that, and so that's why we haven't proposed it in our investment portfolio. And they're only focusing on what the municipality can do in the streets and in the open spaces. And we want to kind of create an understanding that a sponge park is different from just putting a recharge well in an open space. And so I think they want to see the sponge park as being same as doing a sponge building. Like, okay, is it just a product that I attach to an existing building and then I'm done? But the thing about open spaces is you have to negotiate a lot of interests. No open space is neutral, especially if it's already used by the community. So you do need to account for quite a bit of things in an open space: the grading, the programs, the adjacencies, how it links up to the stormwater drains. And there's many other different things that we can do that increases the co-benefits as well. So in many ways, the municipality assumes that rainwater harvesting is taken care of. And it is more of a political issue now because it's about, or not political, it's more of an institutional thing now where they just have to build the capacity to implement and enforce that across the board. Not just the construction of it, but the continued maintenance of it. And I'm sure that's also an issue in Chennai because we don't have very robust protocols for monitoring how much it's working. We also don't have very real-time understanding of the groundwater. So I think there are some sensors haphazardly in different places. We want to make sure that when this project goes into implementation, that we're also budgeting for some monitoring components that basically monitors exactly how much runoff did we manage to reduce and how much aquifer recharge did we manage to increase, and how it responded over multiple monsoons. Because the value of the pilot project is if you're able to quantify those benefits, not just through the model that we have, but through the real world implementation, that can really move things at the institutional level. So we are making sure that the monitoring is there, and we have to make sure the maintenance is there. So we are hoping, we are putting it in the budget. We hope it gets budgeted and it gets done. If not, we will try to find maybe like a CSR partner to take over the maintenance, because that's the number one thing that can reduce the effectiveness of a sponge park, is that if it's not regularly maintained, if the plants are not taken care of, if the inlets and the outlets are not regularly cleaned. And what we want to avoid is for people to dismiss this entire approach because it wasn't well maintained, not because it wasn't well designed, but just because the municipality didn't have the capacity. So the other thing we are trying to promote, and because at some point the municipality said, can you help us build 100 sponge parks? And we said, and can you do it in 2 months? Okay, so first of all, I don't know what you think a sponge park is, but I think if you have the funding to do 100 sponge parks, spend your first year not building things, but really building the capacity within your municipality to understand what it means to site and build a sponge park. Even if you are tendering a sponge park out, like you need to understand where to site them, where to ask for a feasibility study, when to ask for a detailed project report from a consultant if you don't have the capacity, and then just build the internal capacity to maintain these infrastructures, because the Parks Department certainly doesn't have the manuals to do what needs to be done. So hopefully that advice is taken into consideration. I think capacity building is really important at the municipal levels, even if they rely on consultants to actually do the DPRs and the feasibility studies, it's so important. So we hope that we find some institution, maybe multilateral support to do the capacity building that's needed. But step by step, there's a lot of reforms that need to happen.
Thanks. Students, any questions? Faculty? Okay, I think, yeah. So,
Hello.
Yeah.
Hi. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. It was very exhaustive work also that we could see that was put in. Actually, there's one question that I would like to ask. In the city of Mumbai, especially, we see a lot of slum development or illegal development that happens along the edges of the rivers or water bodies, and which are also the ones which are most vulnerable to the floods. So, in your proposal, have you tried to address that in some way, like, or does it address it in a way that, just relocate all the illegal encroachments, or how have you thought of it? Could you please elaborate a little on that?
Yeah, so at least for the pilot projects, we look at places that are not challenged by encroachment. So we have to be very careful about picking a place that doesn't have land ownership conflicts, because our priority is let's get something implemented as a proof of concept. So that's why we also pick 2 different sites to test it, because we don't want to work in that conflicted environment. But then on the metropolitan scale, we definitely are going to put in housing type recommendations, just because we're taking the mantle of resilience. And I didn't get into that topic here, but we're taking the mantle of resilience to not just about disaster resilience, but also socioeconomic resilience, which is like, how do you have the adaptive capacity to be impacted or respond to a disaster? And basically, if your tenure is contested, if your housing is compromised, if your livelihoods are very vulnerable to a day of lost income, you are much more vulnerable to disaster. So again, because our opening is disaster resilience, we are opening up this topic of social vulnerability that happens in informal settlement. So the thing that's happened in Chennai, they have been so proactive on the idea of flood protection based on very faulty data sets. They don't have a very good data set to understand where exactly flooding happens, but they go to neighborhoods, informal neighborhoods only, because there's also sometimes hospitals and other institutions clearly in the floodplain, but they demolish the informal settlements and then they relocate them. And I think they're starting to see the misguided nature of what they do there, because then they take this community into a resettlement tower, towers that are completely removed from transit, and then that community starts suffering, and either they start leaving or they're just now trapped in a worse cycle of poverty, where their houses are better but they don't have any way of earning a living. And currently there are certain neighborhoods where there have been civil society efforts to like paint murals and like beautify those neighborhoods, but it still doesn't do anything to the fact that we have completely ruined the livelihoods of people by relocating them somewhere completely disconnected from transit. So when we get into the development framework, which we're also creating as part of the visioning exercise, we emphasize that nobody should be lacking access to transit. And if you're not near transit, ensure that there's last mile connectivity, and that relocation has to be considered of livelihoods. And so there's definitely informal settlements at clear risk that need to be relocated, because a floodplain is not a place that you can justifiably use to have a foothold in the city, but you deserve that foothold in the city. and you deserve to not be completely disconnected from it. So those things are in there. People aren't exactly coming to us for that kind of advice yet, but we are interested in making sure that a lot of these strategies on restore, when it comes to a riparian area and there's an informal settlement and we are involved, that'll be our thinking, that we will, go beyond our scope to identify where resettlement could happen and that it shouldn't be happening the way that it currently is in Chennai. So I think they're also learning that a bit. So hopefully they'll be a bit more aware about it from this point on. I don't know if Mumbai is aware or trying. I mean, it's been an issue for a while. And yeah.
Anyone? Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Okay, thanks a lot, Saurav. I think it was very informative for our students and especially for the studio which we are right now engaging in.
Yeah.
Let's see if we can probably tap you in to probably see the work or review the work. We'll see how feasible that works out. But it'll be great to have you whenever you're in India to probably pop in into the school once again. Then we can see how we can take these kind of discussions forward. Thanks a lot. And before I tune out, I would like you to request you to send your account details.